Let's ask some questions and reflect on these first three chapters, the Garden of Eden, the Top Hat, and the Myths. Starting with the Garden of Eden. What question is written in the very first letter that Sophie receives from the writer of the letters, and why does this question trouble Sophie? Now, if we go to page 3 in the book, we can see immediately, who are you at the top of the page, right? This was the question. And why does this bother Sophie? Because she doesn't really know. She doesn't have an answer to it, right? She tries to think about maybe possible ways of approaching the question. What about her name? She plays around with names. What if she had been named Anne Knutson, for example? Would she have actually been someone else? If you haven't tried this experiment, by the way, try it. If you've acted before or done anything, you might notice how having an alternative name actually results sometimes in us behaving differently or feeling like we're a different person than our normal identity. That doesn't mean that names are all powerful, but there is something interesting to the idea that a name can change the way you feel depending on which name you take on, especially if you've identified by one name your entire life. I've thought of this constantly. My first name being Kelsey, which is today typically a woman or girl's name, and used to be in the day a boy or man's name only, is one of those things that I played around with before. Maybe I should take my middle name Philip instead. And I felt that out and realized, no, I never liked the idea of being Philip. Philip felt like a different person to me. If you haven't done so, experiment with your name and see, how do you feel different when you change your name like that? What was the second question asked in the subsequent letter? And how does Sophie answer this at first, and why is she ultimately unable to answer it? So we can look here on page 5 and see that the question is, where does the world come from? In the in-depth section, these were the two questions we entertained regarding mythology. Who are you and where does the world come from? But she finds she's unable to answer this because of a contradiction. So let's back up. There it is. She comes back to it on page 7, excuse me. What annoying questions, by the way, she writes, or she thinks to herself. We'll come back to that in a second. Anyway, where did the letters come from, etc., etc. The letters themselves are interesting to think about where they came from. But so she's going to start puzzling over this. She starts wondering, perhaps nothing. This is closer up to the top of the page, by the way. Having no idea, she only knew that the world was, for her, this small space on this small planet of Earth, right? And then she had to ask, well, so where does that come from? Because that's getting closer to the heart of the question. Not just where does this world of mine come from, but where does the world in general come from? Not just my place on the planet, but the planet. What about the space around the planet? What about, the solar system and so forth, if we're speaking about it scientifically? This is a great question because philosophers over antiquity have puzzled over it and still to this day puzzle over it. Usually we think this is a matter of physics, but physics doesn't have an ultimate answer either. If you're not sure about that, go look up physicists' explanations, and even the ones that are very sure of their explanation often are left with this same conundrum, this same contradiction. On the one hand, if the universe always existed, could that happen? Could that be the case? Could it have always been there? But the alternative is that it came from nothing, which also seems equally impossible. So she's left unable to answer the question due to this paradox, as it were. And a paradox here means two opposite things, each seeming equally likely the case, or at least reasonable, and yet completely unable to exist at the same time. It wouldn't be possible for the universe to have always existed and to have come out of nothing. She's left unable to answer it. Now, looking at the top hat, what does the new letter tell Sophie is the only requirement for being a philosopher, and why is this and not something else the only requirement? Let's see. If we look on page 15 for this one, it says in bold, not bold, but in capitalized letters, the only thing, says the philosopher, we require to be good philosophers is the faculty of wonder, which is at wonder, sorry, wonder, not wander, wonder, which is what this course has been named before, the faculty of wonder. That's it. And he mentions, of course, that babies and children have this faculty. We often are born with this faculty, but sometimes it is bred out of us over time. This question, why is the faculty of wonder a requirement and not other things requirements, is a really good question. So if you continue reading on, it talks about the baby who's enthralled with things, is enraptured by things, and so forth. The whole point is that it doesn't have any, and then there you've got the dad who floats out of the chair, and the kid gets excited, but isn't scared necessarily by it, right? Why? What's the difference between the child who's excited seeing dad float out of his chair and mom who is all throwing her hands up and screaming in fear? Because mom has grown up her whole life conditioned by what she's been told and what she believes to be true, to look at the world a certain way. And the child simply seems enraptured by everything. The faculty of wonder opens us up to not getting stigmatized, not falling into one pattern of thinking about how the world is or ought to be. We can end up developing a philosophy in the end, by the way, that requires us, or we can develop a philosophy that tells us, okay, I have a sense of how the world is or how I think it ought to be. That doesn't mean you're no longer a philosopher when you do that. It simply means that as a philosopher, if you exercise the faculty of wonder, you'll continue to ask those questions. You won't always be left in the end. There are very few philosophers who, at the beginning of their history, of their writings and everything, look exactly the same or even similar sometimes to the way philosophers at the end of their period of time looked. Plato at the beginning looks really different from later Plato at the end. Kant in the beginning can look somewhat different from Kant in the end, although it was all kind of the same time period for him. Anyway, so we continue to want to ask these questions. We continue to want to wonder about the world. This is why this is the requirement. All right, the next question, how does Sophie's mother respond to Sophie when she tries to tell her about her introduction to philosophy? Obviously, she reacts poorly. And what does this say about her, perhaps? Well, he mentions this. I mean, the way she responds isn't altogether different from the way that Sophie responded at first to the questions, right? What annoying questions in chapter 1 in the Garden of Eden. What annoying questions. The difference is that Sophie continues to pursue an answer to some extent until she realizes, I don't have enough experience doing this to answer these. But she doesn't throw her hands up and say, annoying questions that these are impossible questions, or these questions are nonsense, or we shouldn't be asking these questions. She doesn't do that. That is the reaction, though, of her mother. Her mother then resembles, in this analogy of the rabbit and so forth here on screen with the magician, resembles that whatever that flea or whatever that being who is down embedded in the rabbit's fur, while Sophie is willing to crawl out and try and understand what's going on in the world around, the magic that is all around her. Let's move on to the myths, last chapter. So on page 22, we're going to look at 22 and 23 for this first one. How does the writer of the letters characterize mythological explanations for what we see in the world? Well, first, Gardner mentions myths themselves as a story about the gods, which sets out to explain why life is as it is. This is a really simplified explanation or simplified definition of myth. We don't want to always interpret myth this way, but for our extents and purposes regarding ancient Greek culture, this works. Talking about things in terms of gods and what the gods do as explanations for what's going on around us. Now, the actual, you could say, definition or explanation for it, mythological explanation specifically, is on page 23. This was the mythological explanation for how the balance of nature was maintained and why there was a constant struggle between good and evil. And ultimately, it'll be the one that the philosophers reject or wish to overcome in their questions, their lines of questions and thinking. So mythological explanations tries to account for natural phenomena that happen in the world, which we talked about in the in-depth section again, as well as morality. What is good and bad in the world? And I want to come back to that in a second because that could end up being very important for us. What specific thing does the writer of the letter say brought about the criticism of these myths by the natural philosophers, and why? This is another way of framing this question is what happened that allowed for people to start criticizing the myths or thinking at least a little bit more deeply about them. And if you go to page 26, here's one potential answer. This is the answer I would have been looking for, but maybe you'll find another one that's equally good. He says, around 700 BC, much of the Greek mythology was written down by Homer and Hesiod. This created a whole new situation. Now that the myths existed in written form, it was possible to discuss them, and then talks about criticizing the mythology after that. So we could say the invention of writing was possibly the most important thing that happened for the development of science and philosophy, both of which are going to follow this. Because we were then able to really look at it, criticize specific points because we could clarify those points, regurgitate those points, talk about them with other people. Writing was essential for this to come about. If we couldn't have that, then the stories could continue to be fluid, and maybe for a good reason, in order to be more resilient to other explanations, it could continue to change. So writing it down kind of set it in stone and made it possible for us to criticize it. And then what positive points of mythological explanation are there over empirical ones? And what are their weak points? What I mean by empirical, by the way, of course, is something a little bit more scientific. That is something where we are observing something and we're trying to take account of that thing, not by way of explaining it with things that we can't observe. So we can never really directly observe the gods, but we can observe the behavior of the gods, or the results of the behavior of the gods in mythology, is the idea, if you take it literally anyway. But then science or empiricism, whatever you want to call it at this moment, because right now they're almost the same thing, we could say that the what is observed and recorded can also hopefully be framed by what is also observable. What else we could possibly see in the world if we were to look hard enough, right? And not by something that we were just told or handed down to us. But that's not the question. The question is, if anything, that might be a weak point, but let's get back to that. What positive points do myths have over empirical ones or later science? Well, for one thing, science is not in a position, or empirical observations are not in a position to tell us what's right or wrong. That thing about good versus bad, where is that specifically? Let's see, 26. So just if you peruse the pages between 25 and 27, what you'll find are explanations for the causes for natural things, but importantly, the good versus the bad also matters here. Right and wrong, good and bad. These are things that can be true, but aren't scientific. So mythology can give us a way of approaching good and bad. Later, philosophy does too. Morality, in fact, I would say that's one of the first things that philosophy actually tackles as a question pretty soon later on after the natural philosophers. But Garter says, no, right away, empirical observations is what's going to give way to philosophy. Anyway, mythology does have something true about it. It can tell us things or give us at least explanations of morality, some of which we may continue to regard as right versus wrong, good versus bad. And that's something no empirical measure or science itself can tell us. It can inform us of facts, or what we call facts, or it can give us information to make moral judgments, but it can't tell us ultimately what's right or wrong to do. That's one of the weak points of science. Now, the weak points of mythology, positive points being that it can talk about these things. Oh, by the way, one other quick positive point. Science is beautiful. I'm a huge advocate for exploring science as a way for exploring the beautiful. But that's not all that is beautiful. Art is an extremely beautiful practice as well. And art informed by science is moderate at best, moderate in its beauty. Mythology is insanely beautiful. The aesthetics of mythology bring us in touch with something else that can be true without being factual, without being let's say, it doesn't have to be so much true in a scientific sense. It could be true in an aesthetic sense. It could be true about morality. It could be true of a number of things. So mythology is, I think, more than even Garter, I think has positive points beyond just explaining good and evil. It also has a way of helping us get in touch with something that's also true in an aesthetic sense or in a sense of beauty. But let's get back now to the weak points. What are the weak points? Obvious weak points is Thor in actuality does not cause thunder. So if we're trying to predict rainstorms or, all the instruments with which we try to understand what the weather is going to be today or this week, we don't want to rely on mythology for the explanation for that. Likewise, if we're trying to build a spaceship to get to the moon as we have, mythology is not going to help us much. So obviously, weak points include its lack of useful, we could say, explanations for natural phenomenon, at least as far as we wish to develop technology or wish to come up with closer to actual accounts, maybe. That one's kind of an iffy one to me, too, for reasons I can explain later. One other thing, though, one other bad point here is we've talked about religion. Religion's not bad, by the way. Don't get me wrong. Not at all. Religion is, again, just a way of codifying mythology into a specific set of practices and rites. You have an authority. But there is fundamentalism. And fundamentalism, we could say, and dogma, which we'll talk about later as well, what dogma means. But these are also things that are commonly harmful, or at least more harmful than they are beneficial. And so religious fundamentalism does have its downsides, huge downsides. People have been killed over other people's mythology. And that obviously is not terribly enlightening. All right.